Beirut was called the Paris of the Middle East, and Lebanon the Switzerland of the East, or the Middle East. It was a very scary time. I remember in my first year, or maybe first couple of years, every weekend there would be a bombing somewhere in the capital or in the larger capital where there was a instability. So you're afraid for your life. Most people in Lebanon immigrate in general. I think the statistics are 50% of the people who are in my age group leave. Targeted cold emails, I think they still work, and they still work for me now. Whenever I'm trying to explore something new, sometimes I'm just gonna cold email someone. Computers are not smart. The people who make computers are the smart ones. If you could be one character from a movie in real life, what would you like to be?
Welcome to the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast, where we talk to computer scientists who immigrated from their home countries for study or for work or for other reasons. In these oral history interviews, you will find established and renowned computer scientists from across academia and industry narrating their experiences of immigrating from where they grew up to a completely different land, often the US. My name is Indy Gupta, and I'm your host. I'm delighted to welcome Fadel Adib, who is an associate professor at MIT, to the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast. He's been there at MIT since 2016, where again he's associate professor in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science department. He's also Doherty Chair, and he also leads his group in the MIT Media Lab. He directs the Signal Kinetics group, which invents new technologies to interconnect, sense, and perceive the physical world. He is also an entrepreneur. His commercialized technologies are used to monitor thousands of patients with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and COVID-19. His work has won many prestigious awards and accolades, including the MIT Technology Review's Innovators TR35 Under 35 Award. That's given to very innovative technologists who are under 35. Also the Forbes 30 Under 30, which is very, very prestigious. He's also won the ONR Young Investigator Award, the NSF Career Award, and a Sloan Research Fellowship. This is where I go in reverse chronological order. Before joining MIT as faculty, he finished his master's and PhD from MIT. He came to the US in 2011 to do his master's. He finished the master's in 2013, and then he finished his PhD in 2016. Before that, he grew up in Lebanon, a very multicultural country that is in the western part of Asia, surrounded by Israel, Syria, and the Mediterranean Sea. He received his Bachelor of Engineering in Computer and Communications Engineering at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon, where he was from 2007 to 2011. He also graduated with the highest GPA on the university's record at that time. And before that, Fadel Adib was born in Tripoli, Lebanon in 1989 and did his early and high schooling in Lebanon. Welcome, Fadel, to the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast, and thank you for being willing to share your story and journey with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
So you were born in 1989 and went to middle and high school in Lebanon in the 1990s and 2000s. Tell us about your earliest childhood memories and kind of what got you interested in math and science.
So I was born in Lebanon the same year the Civil War ended. So we had a civil war for about 15 years right before I was born. And while growing up, my parents used to, one of the most common phrases that my parents and their generation used to tell us is, may you have beautiful days. And the reason why they used to say that is because they meant that we would have peaceful days since they were just coming out of a war. It was a time of a lot of sort of happiness, of people were optimistic about the future, about rebuilding the country. I went to school in a village, which was outside of Tripoli. My parents decided to send us to that school. It was called International School because it was a secular, a very secular school. And so they wanted to, after a sectarian civil war between Muslims and Christians, they wanted me and my sister to go to a school that had fundamentally secular principles. And in terms of what got me excited about science and math in general, sometimes during elementary school, when we started being exposed to chemistry, I remember after the very first chemistry class we had, maybe that was fourth or fifth grade, I remember going back home and telling my mother, I want to be a chemist. It's like magic. You have these potions and you combine them and you have something new happens. And which you did not expect. And then when we started learning physics, I went and I said the same thing. Oh no, I actually prefer physics because it has a little bit more math with it. And so a lot of this came natural to me. I loved the sciences. The sciences always felt like that you were doing magic. And I was always a fan of sci-fi, of fantasies. I'm still a fan of them today. And so being able to do technology, this is the closest thing that you can have to doing magic in today's world. And I'm still fascinated when research works, even as a faculty today.
You described the time early in your childhood as being kind of a time of hope and renewal in the country right after the Civil War.
Right.
Did that last for a while as you were in school, or did that?
So when you grow up in Lebanon, it was hope, but there were also many setbacks. Like I've lived through a few wars while growing up. I remember seeing very sort of heartbreaking footage on TV. I've lived through a couple of wars where I had to stop doing everything and just work on humanitarian aid. And sometimes whenever that happens, I have to do that again today because at the end of the day, human lives are more important than anything. But there was still this feeling of optimism. It went on until I was about 15. But then we had a big assassination in the country. Of our prime minister was assassinated. And unfortunately, I don't think the country ever recovered from that. And it's been actually quite like there has been some level of unrest since then. But you live through it and you want to live. Like people, there's a saying in Lebanon that people will party even when like they're being bombed because you want to live. We love life. And that is the way that you fight for yourself. It's by letting yourself live.
So the assassination you were referring to is Rafiq Hariri.
Right. The Rafiq Hariri assassination, I think around in 2005, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
So you mentioned that when war happened or a humanitarian crisis happened, you had to essentially drop everything and do something for the humanitarian crisis. Can you give some experiences of yours?
Yeah. So, for example, in 2006, there was a war between Hezbollah and Israel, and we saw the images on like the TV. We saw the video footage, and there were like kids who had nothing that they could do in the south of Lebanon. I grew up in the north. That was in the south. And that it happened during the summer which was before my senior year of high school. I was supposed to be studying for my SATs back then. These are also important in Lebanon to be able to be admitted into undergrad. And they were also the year before my baccalaureate, where people usually start studying a year in advance for these major exams that we have to take. But of course, I couldn't do any of that. So I started studying right away. The war started, I think, in June or in July. I can't remember exactly. We had to put everything to the side, and I joined the Red Cross. And we started also creating connections with the United Nations for humanitarian aid. So we were in a city that was relatively far from where the war zone was. And so we would go around, we would collect money, we would go to the markets, we would tell people, look, we want to buy like tissue paper, we want to buy clothes, just want to buy to the refugees who are moving from the south and coming here. And we did all of this fundraising, we were working with the UN, people would give it to us for free. And so then we would go and like sort of take it also to people and help them with their sort of being able to get back to their lives. this went on until the rest of the summer. The summer ended, and of course, then there's all of these things that happen after the war, and the war ended during that summer, thankfully. But then I realized that school was about to start, and I did not study for my SATs. So I remember there was this weekend, and there was this book called The 1,100 SAT Words that I had bought, and I just literally just kept walking back and forth and memorizing as much as I can of these words. And after, I think the following week, I just took my SATs, and I did reasonably well. I did pretty well.
And were your friends also involved in these humanitarian activities?
Yeah, they were. So my sister was already in college. She had a professor who was teaching, but also was in the UN. So it's a lot of it was a community. So everybody was touched by what was happening, of course, and everybody wanted to help. So my existing friends were helping, but also I made a lot of new friends through these volunteer efforts that I was part of. Of course, there was a lot of people who were leading them as well.
And was your family in support of you participating in these activities?
Oh, absolutely. If it was anything to do with violence, my family would definitely not be supportive. But something for humanitarian aid, absolutely. They were actually going around with my dad is a medical doctor. So, for example, he would also be treating people who were refugees for free. My mom is a university professor, so she had the summers off. So she was actually the one who was driving us around to be able to buy stuff and send it to people.
I want to come back in a little bit to the entrance exam to the universities. I want to ask a little bit about the school education. What languages, spoken languages, were you taught subjects in, especially science and math subjects?
Yeah, so science and math in Lebanon, you either can take them in English or in French. These are and your parents choose which type of school you're going to go to. So when it comes to sciences and math, I've had pretty much my entire schooling in English. We take other things like history or geography or some of the social sciences. We learn them in Arabic, which is the native language. But one of the things to know about Arabic is that spoken Arabic is very different from, for example, the different dialects that people speak. And linguists even consider them to be sufficiently different languages to the sense that the written Arabic, which is the one you also learn in school, this dates back more than 1,500 years ago, and it has been preserved for all of this time. But the language we speak is almost like a Creole of Arabic and whatever languages were there, including some English and some French, which is part of our everyday vernacular.
And is Arabic different in different parts of the world? So the Lebanon Arabic will be different from the Arabic spoken in, say, Saudi Arabia.
Right. They are to some extent mutually intelligible, but I think they're more intelligible the closer you are. So, for example, it's much easier to understand Syrian Arabic or Palestinian Arabic or Jordanian Arabic because these are countries that the Arabic has evolved reasonably close. It's much harder to understand Moroccan or Tunisian Arabic because these are in sort of Western Africa. I understand them a bit because my great-grandmother is from Tunisia. But the further you are, the languages change, although interestingly, modern media has brought them a little bit closer together again, which is fascinating in modern times.
And your great-grandmother migrated from Tunisia to Lebanon?
Yeah, so my mom's grandmother, she immigrated from Tunisia to Lebanon, but you have to think about it at the time. That was all part of the Ottoman Empire. So at the time, it's like moving from Massachusetts to California in the US today. They moved from Tunisia to Lebanon. And there's also this whole story about how they ended up in Tunisia in the first place because they were her grandmother was in Sicily in southern Italy. But that's what happens around the Mediterranean. People move around. Actually, pretty historically, they moved around a lot.
Yeah, a lot of nomadic movement there.
Right.
And like you said, when the Ottoman Empire was there, it was pretty large and it covered a large area. So people would just move inside the empire itself. A couple of tech questions. So when did you use your first computer and when did you learn your first programming language?
I think I used my first computer maybe 96. It was Windows 95 for sure. Maybe it was 96.
You're like 7 or 8 years old.
Yes, and we also had dial-up. We also had dial-up internet, and we got the computer because it had dial-up internet, and I think it was like $4 per hour or per minute, or I don't know. It was something very expensive at the time. And that was the first time. In school, we learned some, if you consider like PC Logo to be a programming language, we learned PC Logo, but I didn't like formally learn programming until my first year of undergrad. And by the time I started, I was like, I had a lot of friends who had been programming for, I don't know how many years, 8 years or so. And I felt I was already behind, and I would not be able to go that far with in computer science. But it turns out that you can actually learn programming, and it's not super hard, even if you start learning it in the first year of undergrad.
Was programming taught in schools? Like, were a lot of your friends learning programming at home or in school?
Not really. I mean, again, unless you consider PC Logo, which is, I mean, it's a visual, to some extent, programming language with the turtle, that we were taught in school. But aside from that, it was not at the time, it was not, I mean, we didn't even have a computer lab in school for a long time.
Right. This is the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast interview with Fadel Adib, Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at MIT. Okay, so now I want to ask about the entrance to the universities itself. So when you're towards the end of your high school, you're already interested in science and math. Did you consider options of where you wanted to study, and did you consider options of what you wanted to study?
To be honest, I enjoyed science and math in general. I also enjoyed languages and social sciences. I just loved to learn. That was sort of the general thing. And I considered different options. I considered whether I wanted to, and I was wondering, what is it that I can do in high school? My parents are not engineers, so a lot of smart people were doing computer and communications engineering. And I was like, maybe that's what I should do. I applied to that. I applied to medicine. And I applied to business. And frankly, we weren't as much exposed at the time. I knew that I liked the sciences in general. So when I was accepted, I was like, okay, I'll try it out, see how it works, see how well I end up doing in it. It ended up going well for me.
So you went to the American University of Beirut. Is there an admission process to the university? You mentioned earlier an exam. Can you explain a little
Right. So the admission, it's a private university in Lebanon, so it's pretty expensive. And I was not sure if we were going to be able to afford it. We might not have been able to. So I started planning for university when I was in the beginning of high school. So I knew that there's a very small number of scholarship that they give, and they give them based on your high school scores and based on your SATs. So I knew that if I work very well during high school, then I might be able to get the scholarship. There's only 10 scholarships that they give across the entire university. About I think every year they admit 2,000 people. So it was pretty selective, and everybody in Lebanon applies to it. And it also has a lot of applications. Not everybody in Lebanon, but a lot of people in Lebanon apply to it. It also has a lot of applications from the Arab world, because it historically is a very well-known university as well. It's been around for almost 150 years. I had to take the SATs, which I took right after the 2006 war, and I applied in Lebanon, and one of my cousins at the time was applying to, he was applied a couple of years before me externally. He applied to actually McGill in Canada, and I was like, I'll also try to apply to McGill, and I did apply, and I was lucky that I got scholarships in both AUB and in McGill, and I was very excited about both. One of the reasons why I decided to stay in Lebanon is because I sort of knew that eventually the rest of my career was going to be outside of the country because I wanted bigger opportunities that are than those that are available there. So I decided to stay mainly so that my parents can get a little bit more of me during those sort of 4 years of undergrads, because I felt they were not ready to see me go at the time.
Right. So these SATs that you wrote, these are the same SAT exams that students in the US write for university here.
Right. So there's the SAT one, not the SAT two. I don't know if there's still this distinction between them. But yeah, the SAT is where we had to do the math, the writing, and the English. And at the time, the math was relatively easier for us because the math that we take in school is pretty advanced. The English was the harder part because our vocabulary was not as rich as people for whom English is the native language.
And so you get into AUB, American University of Beirut, and like you mentioned before, you had interest in a variety of different things: business, social sciences, and science. And you're thinking, if I understood you right, is, well, let's try out this computer science thing. At what point of time did you start to think during your time at AUB that this is something that I like?
I think I really liked programming. I liked algorithms. It's like, this new way of thinking, of making, I remember when I started learning programming languages, I was like, computers are not smart. The people who make computers are the smart ones. I remember thinking about it. It's like the way these things work is because people write these elegant programs despite these very difficult constraints on them. And they are able to do these fascinating things. I think that was in my very first semester. I really enjoyed algorithms. I mean, we take programming and algorithms together, where we learn sorting and searching and what have you. But I also still like sort of hardware as well. We were taking hardware, so I like the ability of being able to build things. So I like building hardware things, but also being able to program them. And over the course of my undergrad, I just kept liking it more and more. And I've been doing that over the past, 14 years now.
Is the curricula that you went through in AUB, were there similarities between that curricula and the computer science curricula that you see in US universities? Was it structured similarly?
To some extent it is. I actually did like that curriculum in the sense that it has a relatively small number of introductory courses. But then we take, for example, a full undergraduate computer networks class, which I thought was super helpful for me. We take a full class on like operating systems, another one on databases. One of the things to keep in mind is that the way our schooling works is it's almost as if we do freshman in high school. And then we do another, on top of it, we do 4 years of college, including summers. So summers are included. So you end up with the equivalent of about 6 years if you were to compare it to here in the US. And was very good for me because I ended up having relatively advanced CS, but also relatively advanced EE background, where we took a lot of electronics and circuits, and we also took a lot of advanced algorithms. Our final year of high school is equivalent to freshman. So it's this general, but it's you already get stratified into, for example, I was in math and physics. So we take definitely calculus 1 and 2 and maybe a little bit of calculus 3 in school. Conics, things like conics. The physics that we take is equivalent to the introductory, the two, like electrical as well as magnetics and mechanics. So these we take them in the last year of high school. But then when we are in college, we have to take summer classes. Like the first summer we have to take classes, the second summer we have to take classes, because they're expected to cram 5 years in 4 years. So the American University of Beirut is trying to abide by both the US system, where it's like 4 years, but also the Lebanese system, which expects you to take 5 years after that sort of 1 year that you do in high school.
I see. Do you think there is a benefit of having a similar system in US schools? Because here US schools, I guess in the last year of US school, they have some advanced placement classes, but the Lebanese system you're describing is significantly advanced, and it gets you into your major, in your case, computer science, much earlier in your college career. Do you think something like that might help in the US system?
One of the things about the US system is that it could be that schooling, there's so much differences between schools. Of course, in Lebanon, there's also differences between schools, but like private school is also relatively cheap in Lebanon. Like you can go, almost everybody goes to private school. And what I mean by everybody is like everyone working class or white collar or like people in general go to. And so private schools end up being reasonably good. You can send your kids anywhere you want. In the US, to some extent, you might be limited in the region where you are. So if you don't come from a relatively affluent neighborhood, your school doesn't end up being as great. And so maybe some level of having that background in college again might actually be helpful. So I don't know as much of the educational system to be able to give an answer, but it might be good the way it currently is.
Okay. I want to ask about your first steps into research. Did you get involved with research at AUB in your undergrad?
Yeah, I remember I always wanted to do something that is new and different. So I knew that I liked creating new things even when I was very young. So this realm of invention. And when I got to undergrad, I was like, finally, we can do something that is different. We can do something that is possibly inventive. And I realized that the way to do that is by doing research. So one of my professors had just moved actually he had just joined the university. He had just moved he was in the US at Intel, and he had just moved back to Lebanon. And in my spring semester of the very first year, he asked me if I wanted to do research, and I just jumped on it. So in my first year, I started doing research with him, and I continued doing that throughout my undergraduate degree.
What topic was that research in?
I did on sort of signal processing at the time, which was the area that he had been working on. Yeah.
So there was a connection between what you worked on there and then also a little bit of what you worked on in your PhD later as well.
There is. I mean, I actually see signals in almost anything. I see signals a lot in many computer science topics. I think of the world maybe is in terms of signals, these invisible things that surround you or that you can manipulate in interesting ways.
You're listening to the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast interview with Fadel Adib, professor at MIT.
But actually what happened is, I said that during the summers we were expected to take classes, but there's one summer during undergrad where we were expected to do an internship, and we can do an internship in industry or in academia. Mm-hmm. And so about a year before we start preparing for it, and I started looking online to see what are like types of projects that I would be interested in. I found this a faculty at MIT whose research I was very interested in, and I cold emailed her. Of course, the email took about 2 weeks to write, which I think those were 2 very well invested weeks. And I wrote an email about like why I like her research and what distinguishes me at the time, and why I would like to do an internship with her. And about a week later, she replied to me and saying, "Oh, your background sounds strong. I'd like to set up a call with you and interview you." And it took a lot of time to set up that call. I think I was a bit stressed for maybe a month and a half. But eventually we had this call, and she sort of was interviewing me on the phone. And that interview was postponed so many times, but eventually it happened. And when it happened, I think the first 10 minutes were a little bit sort of like mellow. Not much was exciting. I think I might have been a bit shy. About 15 minutes in, she was like, "Okay, good. I have enough information." And I was like, "I don't think this went as well as I wanted it to go." Mm-hmm. So then I was like, "I don't think you have enough information. You should be asking me more questions." And then I think I opened up, and I got more courage, and I started talking more. And then it went on maybe for an hour or an hour and a half. Mm-hmm. And at the end of that call, she was like, "Okay, I really like you. Let me see there's a way for me to extend you an offer." And at the time, just coming to the US for an internship, that's a very expensive thing to do. Right. So I asked her if it was possible to be funded. because I don't know if I can pay for being able to come here. And she told me, I've never done it before. Let me look into it. And she did actually, for the first time, offer someone a research internship. And that's how I ended up actually. That's how I first came to the US, and I first came to MIT during the following summer as a research intern.
So cold emailing does work.
It still works now. I think people are. Of course, your advisor eventually becomes your friend, especially when you become a faculty. I was even speaking to my advisor maybe a few weeks ago, and I told her, "Oh, I'm doing this," and she was like, "How did you do it?" And I told her, "I just cold emailed them," and she's like, "Huh, cold emailing works." And I was like, "That's how I connected with you. I also cold emailed you," but it was not a generic email, the one that I sent. I actually looked her up. I looked what she's working on. I was like, oh wow, I would be very excited if I can do something like this. And I think my background is a good fit. And so I spent a lot of time and I sent that email after it. So a lot of, it wasn't a mass email that I sent. I think these definitely don't work. But targeted cold emails, I think they still work, and they still work for me now. Whenever I'm trying to like explore something new, sometimes I'm just gonna cold email someone and ask them, "Hey, I'm really interested in this." And of course, I spend a lot of time even now as a faculty writing these emails because these people don't know who I am. So trying to reach outside of my community is. I need to invest time in doing that.
This is very useful because a lot of students send cold emails to professors, and fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of these cold emails get ignored and never answered. So it sounds like what you're saying, good rules of thumb include reading up on who you're emailing and trying to find connections. Should the email be short or long, or are there other rules of thumb that you would recommend?
I think the emails, I get a lot of cold emails, of course, and I sort of sympathize with a lot of the people who are writing cold emails because that's what I still do now and that's what I did in the past. I think the email should be, they need to think about the audience and the purpose. So who is this email being sent to and what is their purpose out of the email? And whatever they say in the email should say that. We don't need to know about their I don't need to know about someone's whole life story, but I need to know the most interesting thing. So for example, when I cold emailed my advisor, the person actually who I wanted to intern with, I was like, "Hello, I am looking for an internship. I am a third year student at the American University of Beirut. One thing about me is that I have the highest GPA in my class, and maybe I said in the history of the university up until now, which was true, but it was something that I led with. And I would, you're working in the area of wireless networks. I think my background at the intersection of electrical engineering and computer science would be helpful. I would love if I can have the opportunity to have an internship with you." It was reasonably a short email, but it had like one thing. And I think what I heard afterwards is that she asked someone, "Is this person really is the one fact that he told me, is that a correct fact?" And she was told yes. And she was like, "Oh, this person is worth investing in." So it's usually not, "Oh, I did A, B, C, and D." But there's this one interesting thing of why I think I might be specifically relevant and worth to take a risk on. And I realized that it was a risk because, I'm cold emailing with no connections from like halfway across the world.
Yeah. That's great advice. So returning to your timeline a little bit. So you mentioned that you had the highest GPA, and I also mentioned that you had the highest GPA in the history of AUB. That seems to indicate that the grading is somewhat tough and difficult in AUB. Is that a correct characterization?
I mean, grading is in generally, it's not, first at the time at least, it was not on a 4-point scale. So you could get anything between a 0 and 100. The passing grade is usually 65. But usually when you're above 90, the higher you end up going, it becomes really harder because if you want a really high grade, you almost need to get 100 on most of a lot of the classes. And so it was part of the grading. People would give 100, but you really have to make 0 mistakes in the entire class. And so I don't know, for good or for bad, of course it helped me at the time, but I would optimize for the common mistakes that I would make in exams, so that I would not go into an exam and make those mistakes, so that I can get that perfect grade that would get me sort of a high GPA.
Again, returning a bit to the political instability, which we talked about earlier, that of course was, at its peak when during your years in AUB 2007 to 2011, that was right after Rafiq Hariri's assassination in 2005. Did that have an effect on your life in the university and the life of your friends?
Yeah, of course. I think it was a very scary time. I remember in my first year, or maybe first couple of years, every weekend there would be a bombing somewhere in the capital or in the larger capital where there was a instability. So you're afraid for your life, really, there. And then you're like, oh, the other thing about when these things happen is, do I know anyone who was impacted? Where did this happen? I heard this. Who was assassinated? All of these, and you're trying to study at the same time. So it was a bit crazy. And then also in May of 2008, there was also a lot of civil unrest in Beirut. We had to escape the city early around dawn to make it home. And then for 3 weeks we had no college, because we were like, what the hell is going to happen in the country? We were studying, but you had all of these sort of things that pull you away. I mean, the news, politics invades your life. When I came to the US for an internship, the first thing that I felt is, oh my goodness, politics is not invading my life. I can finally, for the first time, actually focus. Of course, when I speak to my family, I'm checking on them, but I am able to focus on doing work. So instead of trying to cram so much in 10% of the time, I have 100% of the time. I have 10 times more to be able to actually do work. I know it sounds like an exaggeration, but it is not. Earlier this year, I had to go back to Lebanon because my mother contracted a critical case of COVID. She was hospitalized, so we were concerned. It was a very stressful time, but I had to go and spend 2.5 weeks. And I realized why I used to feel that way. You lose electricity, and then you're waiting for a backup generator to come. When you lose the generator, you need to wait for the internet to come back up. You're literally, for every 10 minutes, you can get 1 minute done, and it's very interrupted. So I think looking back, it was very hard, and it is still very hard. And there's all of these constraints that people don't realize. And so when I came to the US, the thing that I realized, being able to work continuously is such a privilege that I never had before, and that really helped me. Also, it's almost as if someone was fasting and suddenly they ate and they have all of that energy. And so for me, it's like it was constrained, and suddenly these constraints were removed, and I kept working almost at the same pace. And so I was able to do much more work than I was able to do in a more constrained environment.
I hope your mother recovered and is doing better.
Yeah, thankfully she recovered, actually, and she arrived in the US on Mother's Day. So that was I had a very nice gift for Mother's Day this year.
Yes, a gift for both you and your mother. I think going back to the country of origin always is a very interesting experience, because you get a culture shock because the country has moved a little bit, but then again you also get reminded of many of the reasons that made it very hard to work there. And in a sense, a lot of this is survival, right? The generator example you were giving is just basic day-to-day things that we take for granted living here in the US and in Canada. Did the instability during your years in AUB, did that have a role to play in your decision to migrate to the US, or was it largely just, I'm just interested in going to the best place?
I think probably in middle school, I wanted to look. I mean, the US is still the land of opportunities, despite what some people might say. I always felt that if you want to go to a place where you can grow, the US was such a big attraction. I think it still is. I mean, my students come from all types of backgrounds from within the US and around the world. And I wanted to do that. In fact, me staying in Lebanon, I mean, there was a great institution that I could go to, which was my undergraduate university, but I also wanted to afterwards be able to move and to actually be able to come to a top university in the US and work and do research.
Were your batchmates with you in AUB? Where did they go? Did many of them come to the US? Did they stay in industry in Lebanon or generally in Asia? What happened to them?
Most people in Lebanon immigrate in general. I think the statistics are like 50% of the people who are in my age group leave. They either go to like the Arab Gulf countries where there's much more opportunities to work, or they come to the US or to Europe, where one of the good things is that the education is actually pretty good. And so we're very well prepared to be able to do things, but also historically, people from that region always moved. I mean, they've always have moved around into it and out of it. It's a coastal country altogether, and when people are by the sea, they're always thinking about where do you want to go next.
It sounds like there is an itinerant or nomadic DNA or a gene in there somewhere. That 50% is a large number, and that must affect the country quite a bit too. Are there discussions in Lebanon of how to maybe stop this brain drain and keep people back, or is that?
When we were young and there was optimism, people used to talk about these things. I think there is very little, unfortunately, there is not much optimism now. So, I mean, it's also a very small country in general. So people in general move around. I mean, imagine that I'm in Massachusetts. Imagine that everybody who's is born in like Western or Eastern Massachusetts just stays in Eastern Massachusetts. It's just too small to be staying there. Even if people wanted to, a lot are going to move to other parts of the state or other parts of the country.
Yeah. This is episode 11, an interview with Fadel Adib, professor of electrical engineering and computer science at MIT and immigrant from Lebanon. So in 2011, you moved to the US, and as you mentioned earlier, one of the first things that struck you is that you had so much more time to do the things that you love and at work. Were there hard things after you moved? Was there few things that you thought was, this is really, really hard to adapt to?
So the first time I came was when I was interning.
You're interning, that's right.
Yeah. And that's when I realized that. And then I went back to Lebanon and I applied for grad school, and then I came for grad school. I think the main thing is, in general, you miss your family. I did feel that I belonged. Like after I came to this, I came to MIT for grad school, and I felt that I did belong. I was speaking to people, that we were sharing things that we were excited about. I was always enjoyed working hard. They enjoyed also working hard. Like there was this nerdiness that people enjoy here that I also enjoyed. But of course, you miss your family, and even more importantly, your family misses you because you've left, and there's this emptiness for them. So I'd say that is the biggest thing. I don't think there was much of a cultural shock. I mean, Beirut is such a cosmopolitan city. When I came to Boston, I was like, places close at 10 like during weekdays, and at like, I don't know, 2 during weekends. And Beirut does not close. So I think it was, we had that feeling, but the language was not really a barrier. I think, of course, there's a lot of cultural nuances that you get more used to, but also even when we were growing up, we would watch a lot of TV shows or movies that were in English. My own mother also had done her graduate school in the US before moving back to Lebanon. So it was, there wasn't much of a shock for me on that front after I came.
So your mom moved back after being in the US. Is that something you considered as you were nearing the end of your PhD?
Not personally. I did not really consider that. The thing that is very different from my parents' generation and my generation is that they grew up in beautiful times in the country. They grew up when Beirut was called the Paris of the Middle East, and Lebanon the Switzerland of the East or the Middle East. So they witnessed such nice times. When we were growing up, we grew up seeing sort of the remnants of the war. And of course, I want to help and I still work with a lot of local communities to help. And there are so many different ways that we can support the communities that we came from. But I did not consider actually moving back after I came.
You finished your PhD in 2016, and then you became a professor at MIT itself. Tell us a little bit about your transition from being a student to being on the other side of the bench, so to speak. And you're also in the same department, essentially.
Yeah, it was, I think the transition, interestingly, really starts when you're interviewing. I was lucky. It was a good year that I was on the job market. I was interviewed in amazing places and had offers from, it was hard to choose. Actually, because the places were so different and so unique. When I started and then I started as a faculty, I think there's so many things that are different that you don't realize. I mean, when you start as a faculty, like people tell you, oh, this is your administrative assistant. And there you go. Now you know you have to be a faculty. Yeah. You're trained how to do research. You're not trained how to manage people. I mean, I was managing almost half of the people in my advisors group, but it is so different once you're a faculty because there's this whole different aura associated with it. Like, for example, I would be working with more junior grad students when I was a PhD student, and I would push them to do things, but I'm pushing them as a student. As a faculty, if you push your students, you don't realize as a starting faculty how much there is a power dynamic. And I was totally unaware of that, and I ended up being a little bit perceived as more aggressive than in my head I was. Like, I was like, oh, let's do this. But sometimes let's do this is understood in a very different way if you're saying it as a peer but more senior versus as a faculty. And I think that was, for me, the biggest difference. It was, how do you manage people? And I think universities in general could do a better job of like onboarding new faculty. Teaching was really helpful for me because I co-taught with colleagues, and so I learned so much from them. Like, I would see them teaching something, I'm like, why are they doing it this way? And then I would see the students reviewed that they really appreciated it. So I learned from teaching with them. I think for management, I learned it first by experimenting a lot, by making, by not doing things the best possible way, and then by reading a lot of books on how you can how do you create a nice culture, how do you manage people in a good way. And unfortunately, also, there aren't as many of these things written for faculty either. A lot of these are written for industry. And so I have all of these books written, oh, this maps to academia, this doesn't, this needs to be done in a different way. And my students also knew, and I started telling them, look, I don't know how to do this, but we'll figure it out together. Let's experiment with this and let's experiment with that. And eventually I brought the scientist and researcher mindset into management, and we started experimenting a lot until we reached a situation where I think there's a lot of cohesion in the group, and the culture thrives where everybody feels that they are very excited and also highly productive at the same time.
Sounds like you got a good taste for guiding students even while you were a grad student, because as you mentioned, you were already managing and working with many of your advisors, students. But it also sounds like you have a kind of a collaborative style to leadership where you talk with your students about advising styles and what works for them. Do you try to tailor your advising style differently to different students, or do you have like one advising style and then that just works for the group?
Yeah, of course it depends a lot on the student, and I always knew that it depends a lot. The question is what is common and what is different. I actually think that the student advisor relationship starts from the very first email, whoever sends it to the other, whether the student to the advisor or the advisor to the student, before you interview. That's where the whole relationship starts. So you want to start with, this is really the beginning of a potential relationship. You might admit or you might not admit. And then the interview itself is also, it's always a two-way interview. And students will remember these interviews, and you will also remember it. So I usually try to make my interviews, really try to drive them with curiosity, learn about people, learn about their backgrounds, what they did, but also be able to go into Am I able to have technical conversations to learn about what they did? Are we able to brainstorm? All of these things are baked into the interview itself. And as a result, sort of the eventually when I then send an offer letter, I immediately follow up by saying, look, I think you're gonna be very fulfilled with us in the research group. And I conduct the interview in a specific way, which was also something that I learned from a lot of these management books. And then when they come, I would usually have a first meeting with them where I onboard them. I give them, again, this sort of pitch for who we are. They've listened to it, but it's fine. I can't say it again. And then I always like to ask a question, which is, if you could be one character from a movie in real life, like what would you like to be? And I always find this to be very helpful because I understand what they aspire to be without asking them, what do you aspire to be? I ask them, if you could be something that is not possible, then what would it be? And that helps me understand where they want to go. And we already are aligned technically. So I know that they're excited about the technical stuff that my group does. The question is, how do we align behaviorally and culturally? And how do I align their career trajectory with where they want to go? And also, while at the same time teaching them about sort of and mentoring them about this whole other sort of aspect. And as they grow, as they progress, then they need to learn how to mentor. And so we have all of these documents in the group that I've written over time. It's like, how do you mentor also junior students? What are the ideal ways of interacting, it's a strong knowledge base for creating these processes and structures for hopefully a very robust research group.
That's such a beautiful question to ask. Which character in a movie would you want to be? It's such an intriguing question to ask.
You get fascinating questions. I get like Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Interestingly, a lot of them are from sci-fi or fantasy, and which again says that these are also people who are excited about the magic that comes out of scientific research.
It's an intriguing question because I tend to ask that same question sometimes of people that I know, not necessarily always my students. And I always get intriguing answers. I'm curious because we end up asking similar questions. Do you ever get answers where someone chooses a character of the other gender or different gender than theirs?
Yeah. I do both ways, actually. I mean, my group is pretty diverse in various ways. And so you get people also sometimes from different cultures who are not thinking purely along gender lines. So you get people who are saying, from different gender. I mean, for us in Lebanon, the differentiator is religion, from a different religion. Like that's how people think about the black or white or the red or blue or whatever is very different across cultures. And I think I'm not very surprised when people say these.
This is the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast interview with Fadel Adib, Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at MIT. We are coming to the last segment of our interview. This is retrospective and perspective. The first question I want to ask here is, are there role models and mentors that you've had? When you mentioned your advisor, are there other role models and mentors you've had through your high school years or your college or your grad school who have made a big impact in your life and your career?
Of course, first, the biggest impact are definitely my parents, my mother specifically. These are the folks who have invested a lot in, over time. In terms of, I've had a lot of support. I think my teachers in school were in general very supportive. I had a physics teacher that really excited me a lot about physics also in high school. I was already excited about it. He just multiplied it maybe by 10. The school principal once came to class when I was presenting and he wanted to become my mentor. He saw me, he was very excited about the presentation that I gave. I was, I think in middle school, and he was the principal of, in Lebanon, schooling is middle school, but also elementary school and high school all together. And he told me, "Oh, you should. I think you would be going to like a top school in the U.S. or Canada when you graduate." Of course, during grad school, my advisor was a big supporter. I always admired. She also came from Syria, so and I was so impressed that a woman from Syria became a professor at MIT. I remember sitting in class and just seeing her, and I was so proud because I admired how much. I know how much she had to go through. And as a faculty, I've also had a lot of mentors and supporters. In fact, the more senior you get, somehow you get even more mentors. I mean, at MIT, my advisor was Dina Katabi, but now Hari Balakrishnan also is a great mentor. Martin Reinhardt is a mentor. Maria Zuber, who is the vice president of research, and she's the one of the President Biden's chairs for the Science and Technology Committee, is also one of my mentors. So I end up with these amazing mentors, and over time I get even like more and more excited about the mentors, and maybe they see something and they want to invest in it. I hope it's similar to how I see things in my own students, and I'm so happy, and I just want to see them grow.
Okay, next question, slightly different. Students, researchers, faculty often have to deal with failures and rejections, and then there is the imposter syndrome where you feel like you don't belong wherever you belong. Do you have advice for people on how to deal with failure, rejections, and imposter syndrome?
Yeah, so very different things, each of them. Failures, I think the biggest failure is to quit a larger agenda. I remember even when I was interning, when I was an undergrad and interning at MIT, I remember halfway through, I thought it was too hard for me. I'm not good enough. It's not going to work out. And I even thought of just leaving. But I knew that my advisor was happy, and I had no idea why she was happy with me. Like, why is she happy with me? I'm clearly not doing good progress. And I remember speaking also to my family and my mother, and she was like, you can book a ticket and come back, but just wait it out. Like, enjoy your life, go out if you want. And of course, my mother knew that I was not going to do that. And I pushed through. And at the end of the summer, my advisor told me, "Oh, you're the best undergrad I've ever worked with. I want you to apply to my group for a PhD." And I did not understand why. And this is where it goes also to imposter syndrome, where people don't know when they are good, if they are good. We always, in my group, usually in the beginning of every academic year, we talk about imposter syndrome because we have new students.
Right.
And I tell them, if you want to, it's very hard to overcome your current imposter syndrome. We all have it at any time. The way you want to think about it is think about your previous stage, not the current stage you are in, and ask yourself, were you good enough? So when I was in school, I had an imposter syndrome. I would go to a new grade, I would have the imposter syndrome again. I would go to undergrad, I would have the imposter syndrome. I came to MIT as a graduate student, and I had the imposter syndrome. But the way I tell myself now is I tell myself, let me look back. If I feel like an imposter now as a faculty, was I a good graduate student? I'm like, yeah, I was a really good graduate student. I wish I would like to have a graduate student like myself be in my group. I mean, I think my students are great, but just to say that this says, I think I was good enough. And when I was in grad school, I could say that about my undergrad. So the way to deal with the failure is to quit. So the way to deal with it is to persevere and to just work hard and keep moving forward. The way to deal with imposter syndrome is to look back and remind yourself at a previous stage how well you were, and remind yourself how you did not think that you were not as great in that stage, even though you ended up, in hindsight, you definitely were great for that stage.
When you have a paper rejected or a proposal turned down, what is your first instinct, and then what is your longer term instinct reaction to that?
Right. I mean, there's the things that we can control and the things that we can't control, even about our own emotions. I think for me now, it's another rejection. We've gotten so many of these at this. I've gotten so many of these at this point. You get some, you don't get some. There is randomness in the process, and I don't take it personally. Of course, it's very different when you're talking to graduate students because they're working so much on a very, very small number of papers. And for example, in systems, it takes us a long time to finish a paper. So it hurts. We sort of identify with it. But identifying with it is good. Like you want to keep this to some extent, this attachment, because you put so much of your heart into it. You don't want to take that away, because that's where a lot of the brilliance comes from. But at the same time, how do you detach yourself from it? And I think this is hard. I remember I was proud in my advisors group that I was the one who had the largest number of rejected papers over there. And I remember the very first paper that I applied, they got rejected. And I moved on. I submitted the second paper, it was accepted. The third paper was rejected. The work that I was doing for my PhD, which was like seeing through walls with Wi-Fi signals or wireless sensing, that stuff was always either rejected or on the verge of rejection because people didn't know what was new. And I remember at some point where my advisor sat with me and she was like, look, sometimes new ideas are hard for people to understand. And this is not on the people. It's also it needs time for them to come across. My paper, which is most cited, was rejected the first time. And then I spoke to other faculty, and many of them say, oh, look, my most highly cited paper was rejected multiple times. And so these things are hard to predict. I think a strong advisor-advisee relationship really helps there, because if you're not doing if the paper gets rejected, your advisor can give a good sense of, look, this is good work, or maybe we should move on and work on something else. And I think the advisor should supposedly have enough wisdom by that time to be able to make that call.
So I want to ask a question about, I guess academia versus industry, but in a slightly different way. So you've had significant success with commercializing some of your research results. Nowadays, even grad students, as when they're in their PhD programs, sometimes they think of, should I open source this? Should I spend the extra amount of energy and effort and time on making this code, less research code and more open source code? And then, of course, as faculty members, we already have a lot of very busy lives teaching and doing research, and then doing entrepreneurial activities is an even higher overhead on that. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that, how you managed the commercialization and entrepreneurialization of your technologies.
Yeah. So the one thing that I'm thinking about always is we're not publishing just for the sake of getting papers. In fact, we spend so much time building a system. Usually it could be anywhere between at least 6 months, really on the short end, but most of the time it's at least a year. It's of the order of a year and a half, right? Building a system. Do you really want that thing that you built to be a paper that maybe someone's gonna pick up, maybe someone's gonna do something with it, or do you want it to have a lot of impact? This year and a half that you spent on something, do you want it to try to have impact so it can change the world? Why did you do this in the first place? So for me, when I was doing my PhD, so first off, I had to build the thing to make it actually work, and people did not believe that it worked. So we had to build a demo and have people come over. And I was a bit entrepreneurial in nature, so I started thinking and telling my advisor, look, we need to start a company based on this. And she also believed in that as well. And so we spent a lot of time refining it and showing it to people, and every time improving it. And in fact, when I was doing my job interviews, I took my device to each of my 16 interviews, and every single time I tested it live. And so people could really falsify me. If you think this is not going to work, you're going to be able to see it there that it's not working. And for me, that was important. It was important to let people believe that it is actually working in this environment where there's so many other people, and I'm trying to sort of do the sensing.
Did it work every one of those 16 times?
It did actually. I mean, it worked in the White House when he demoed it to President Obama, so it should work after. We wouldn't have showed it back then, and that's yet another story actually that I'd be happy to share.
Yeah, please talk about that experience too. Yes.
So what happened is the whole way in which we were invited to the White House is we were interested in commercializing the technology. We participated. MIT has this entrepreneurial competition. The first year we participated, we made it only to the semifinals. The second year we made it to the finals. And so we were picked up by this group that nominated us to go to the White House. And we had to do a demo. And we were not sure if we were going to do it to President Obama at the time. And so we take our device, we fly to DC, we set it up the day before in the hotel lobby, and sort of one of the people I was working with was like, "Oh, it feels like Mission Impossible, like you're setting up and then tomorrow we're going to the White House." Anyway, then we go in, and when you go to the White House, you have to go through so many different layers of security, and the dogs really sniffed out the wires, like they pulled it apart. It's a research prototype. So we go in, we set it up, it's not working. Of course it's not working, like the dogs really pulled it apart. And so we have about 3 hours before someone steps in, and it could be the president. And everybody starts, and I'm like, it works. I know it works. I've tested it and I know it works. So I keep sort of trying to debug it and trying all the knobs that I know how to debug. It's like, there's 2 hours left, it's not working. There's 1 hour left, it's not working. There's like 30 minutes left, it's not working. And about 10 minutes before people start walking in is when it starts working. And I tested it a few times. It's just a bunch of loose connections at the time that I really need to find where all of these are. So it's like research. You just have to do it in 3 hours. And then it worked well. And he was actually quite surprised that it worked, that well. Where I was actually the subject of the demo, and I showed that this wireless device that is in there could monitor my breathing and heart rate without touching my body. And so I was not very concerned. I mean, I knew if it didn't work, I would know how to make it work without having to change anything in it. So whenever I had an interview, I would go in the morning, I would test it out in that setup. I would just make sure that it is working, and then I would leave it there. And to be honest, even if it doesn't work that well, people know it's a research prototype that you're trying to demo in real life. And that's what I tell my students now. So we now invest every single project that we're thinking about. A lot of our projects are moonshot ideas. But eventually we want it to have impact. So we try a crazy idea. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, we try to pivot quickly, but then we build on it. So we write the paper, but then we're building this demo. We also create a video about it because we're building these physical things. And so we usually also create videos about it that can help us talk about it. And then this building good work allows us to build on top of it. One of the hardest things in research is, do you build something and are you able to build yet another system on top of it? And if you build a really robust system, then you are able to build on top of it. And sometimes we open source our code. Like, for example, a lot of our code on Ocean IoT, we are open sourcing all of that because there's so much scientific value in it. And we don't just open source the code, we also open source the schematics. We also write step-by-step tutorials because people need to know. I mean, this is interdisciplinary work. People are coming from different backgrounds to try to build it. If we want our work to have impact and go beyond just a paper, how do you do that? The way is you need to really push it all the way, wherever that is. I mean, sometimes it could be through deployment. Maybe not every paper is gonna do that, but we strive to do that with every paper because really that's what maximizes the impact. And sometimes people might think that, what matters is the number of papers, or what matters is the number of citations. The number of citations might be a good metric. The number of papers is never a good metric. If someone has, 80 papers versus 100 papers or 20 papers, what I care about is in what way have these people changed the world. That's what matters.
Yeah, that's very beautifully put. And an almost heart-stopping experience in the White House, but it seemed like it worked out in the end. I guess my takeaways from that experience were, be prepared. If you're doing a live demo of any kind, be prepared well ahead of time. But then also kind of know your system in depth so that you're confident that if something goes wrong, you have a plan B and a plan C.
Absolutely.
I have two more questions to end the interview. The next question is a little bit speculative, but I'm going to ask it. So you grew up in Lebanon, and now you've spent enough time in the U.S. that you kind of have seen the U.S. education system. The speculative question is: had you been born in the U.S. or maybe in Canada, but not in Lebanon, had you grown up through the U.S. schooling system, do you think your interests and maybe your career would have been same, different, changed?
To be honest, I don't know enough about this system to be able to answer that. I think there is a beauty in being able to come from a very different background and come here as well. I think you're bringing you're bringing different perspectives, which is why being surrounded by a very international people also brings so much perspective. Most of my late night grad school was me speaking to my friends and trying to learn about their cultures from all over the world. So I don't know the answer to that. It's maybe in a few years I will. I think I don't have the wisdom that you have gathered already to be able to answer that question. But maybe, I don't know, in a decade, I'll be able to answer it.
Sort of related to that, because we have several industry professionals who also listen to the podcast. Did you ever consider industry as a career option, or was it always like faculty is what I want to be?
Oh, I considered entrepreneurship as a career option for sure. And I still love doing that. Like for me, every project in our group needs to make it to the real world. Many of the times it makes it through startups. I personally enjoy that element, that part of being able to create something, because it's the group and the product and the industry, and sort of this hard, initial part. All of it is hard, but this initial part of being able to start something when there is nothing, I find it very, very exciting. And this was also one of the reasons that I decided to become faculty, because I could start a research group and I could have the people and also the research that we're doing.
Parents being in another land and us kind of remotely being worried about them and having to go back sometimes, that's a whole other issue.
And feeling guilty and maybe if they could come here. I think that's the thing. And for me, that is the main thing about being an immigrant. It's like your parents, really. It's your family. I mean, your friends, you can make friends everywhere, to be honest. That's what I feel. But your parents, how do you take care of them? How do you stay in touch? How do you support them? And being able to do that without being... there's a lot of guilt associated with that. And it's not an easy trip to make halfway across the world.
It's beautiful. Thank you, Fadel. Thank you for sharing your story and your immigration journey and your thoughts and wisdom with us. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This was episode 11 of the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast. You have heard the immigration story of Fadel Adib, Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at MIT and immigrant from Lebanon. If you haven't already done so, please listen to the lead episode of this Middle East Entrepreneur segment, that's episode 9, featuring both the narrators from the Middle East. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes where we visit other parts of the world. All the music used in episodes of the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast is royalty-free. All voice recordings were performed with and are reproduced with full consent of narrators and participants. You can find music credits on our website. Join the online discussion about this podcast on all major social media, including Twitter and Facebook, with the handle CSImmigrant and hashtag CSImmigrant. And of course, the episode guide is available at our website, csimmigrant.org. This is the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast.